kind of thinking how Japanese, the folk song world there, or the traditional music world, compares to other places I've messed around with. Since I was an American folkie long ago, a lot of that American stuff we did, they were Irish songs. We were singing African songs too, but we didn't even know what the language was, so I don't count those. But did a lot of British Isles music because it was English. We could sing those songs. I was doing a lot of singing and not much instrumental stuff in my folk days back there. I mean, plucking, but not playing solo tunes. And then a little later at university, I joined we had a band that was playing Irish tunes. I had fun with that, mandolin, guitar, even faked the fiddle. And then that went out the window once I got so heavily into Japan and Indonesia, my other big area of traditional music. That's a totally different story. And in retirement is when it's been 8 years since I retired from SOAS, and Gina retired 2 years before that. So now I've got a lot more time to do things I enjoy. And aside from creating and teaching a Japanese and an Okinawan folk group, we meet at SOAS, I go to sessions up in Durham, where Gina taught for her last many years. Several nights a week, they have pub sessions that are mainly British Isles music and mainly tunes, not singing. So you got a lot of Irish tunes, jigs, reels, hornpipes. You've got Northumbrian tunes, you got English Morris dance tunes and other tunes. Occasionally a Swedish tune creeps in. Now some people like Breton tunes. There's more linking with these different regions among such folkies now in the global age. It's easier to pick up tunes from other places. So I do a lot of tune playing up there, and Gina joins in. She plays her whistle and I'm plucking various things. The people who do that, and there is a singing session in town on Thursday nights, which I've only been to once. I used to love to sing all the time. I've got 700 sets of lyrics in a notebook that's sitting around the corner here that I typed up and hand wrote back in the old days of typewriters, when I was a 1960s folkie. All these lyrics. Every once in a while I scan through it and think, what is that song? And how does that melody go? Where did I get that? But actually, maybe 400 of those songs I could have performed in the old days. They're all out the window. And now I've got a tune list. It's about 400 Irish and British and etc. tunes I'm playing now that I could do if I'm reminded a bit. Can't remember what the names of them are because there's no lyrics and there's so many names, no one knows what the names are anyway. Anyhow, that's a lot of fun. And I was just a couple nights ago at the monthly Swedish session in London, which has been going, I'm not sure how long, about 8 years. And they mainly play Swedish tunes. And these little groups are all different. There's only one guy at the Swedish session usually who is Swedish out of 18 people or so. Esbjørn Vettermark has just submitted his PhD thesis at Royal Holloway on Vietnamese music. The only Swede at the Swedish session wrote a thesis on Vietnamese music, and he comes along with his clarinet and sometimes a squeeze box. But he's good, he knows the tunes. It's just, wow. And so it's getting to be and next Saturday there will be Nana from Japan, who I haven't met yet, a Japanese woman who plays the Swedish nickel harp, and we're going to have a session with her. So
this is down in Deptford?
Well, where are we meeting now? They moved around a lot. Now it is kind of a little west of, it's in a pub called the Green Man, a little west of Good Street. And let's see, that was the Swedish one. Tons of Irish sessions. Now this is something, Japanese folk music, partly because the Japanese themselves, by the way, I was going to mention Irish sessions in Japan. Okay, the young Japan, people after 140 years of westernization at least in their education system, becoming global, tons of Irish music sessions in Japan. You can look on a website called thesession.org. You'll find 2,600 sessions around the world listed that are mainly Irish music. And several of these are in Japan. And they come and go a little. It depends, just like our Swedish one has to move from pub to pub if somehow the pub decides they need the space. And when we were there recently, me and Gina, I went to I think 6 sessions and she went to a couple of them. Boy, they're hot. The Japanese there. And there's often a few foreigners like me hanging around, and maybe there's an Irish person, an American or whatever. So they're very keen on that stuff, just as they are in England. And America and Shanghai and saw one near Mexico City. So the world is really keen on this kind of Irish instrumental stuff and spin-offs from it. Japanese folk music is not getting the world. But what gets young Japanese traditionally? Let's see. There's a style, there's two things that you probably know about in the world. Taiko drumming, bang, bang, bang. That only became a real music tradition about 50 years ago. A jazz drummer got it going for complicated reasons, but his local hometown wanted him to try. They'd found in the local Buddhist temple this notation that seemed to be percussion notation for some ritual music from the past. And they said, can you figure out what this stuff means? And he tried to help reconstruct it. And he ended up playing his jazz drum with some traditional drums and making up some new music. And that began the whole thing that is now a group called Kodo, is the most famous now, who perform all over the world. That's become something young Japanese can relate to because they don't have to try and sing in a traditional voice. There's no singing. They don't have to pluck some weird-looking instrument. They just pound the drum. This is just like rock drumming. Cool. So that's a biggie. Then there's a style called Tsugaru Shamisen, three-string plucked banjo-like thing. Now that's been used since the early 1600s for Japanese musics of all kinds, kabuki and others. But the modern folky style, well, basically shamisen doesn't appeal much because it goes with singing all the time. Except now there's an instrumental style that started in the north of Japan, in the Tsugaru region, and it's almost like rock guitar improvisation.
It's really fast?
Yeah, it's fast and powerful, and you don't have to bother to sing, although it's supposed to accompany singing originally, but now it's become, you get long solo introductions even if they're singing afterwards. But they now have national contests for this, where you get a lot of young people mainly, but oldies too, getting together, and they're told they have 3 minutes to an improvisation, and then they have to stop and the next one comes up. And it's not as improvised as jazz and this free jazz type. There's certain styles that you have to follow, kind of. It's a language. You recognize it and you know if somebody's going off on a weird path. There was one British gal, wonderful musician, who took part in a contest back in the late 80s that I attended. I was sitting next to the judge, who was one of my teachers, one of the judges, and after she performed, she was doing very creative stuff, but she wasn't using the language that all the other people were. She's too creative, she's too Western. I mean this not in a critical sense, but in what the judges thought. I knew they weren't going to give her a prize because she was too far from the tradition. More imaginative, less bound by tradition. And I asked my teacher there, what did you think of that? And he said, well, she's technically really good, but that's not Tsugaru Shamisen. So, you still have in Japan this sense that there's a right way to do things. And in an Irish session, you could have the same arguments. But nonetheless, this music really appeals to young Japanese. And then if you don't go to the contest and you want to play with a rock band, they're doing that now. They've got 25 years of recordings of these young shamisen people who started off being loud, pounding folkies, and then became rock musicians as well. I'm not sure that I'm coming up with a pattern here, but the only Japanese music, Irish music's got the whole world. Taiko has now got the whole world. Tsugaru Shamisen, we have a teacher in London, Hibiki, a Japanese, Ichikawa, who also goes to Berlin to teach and often goes other places to do little concerts or workshops. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of Berlin fanatics in this stuff now, Germans and one Japanese. And this really catches on. California is full of people doing this. So this is, if there's any hope for Japanese traditional music reaching the rest of the world, it's going to be drumming, because there's no language problems, and this pounding rock stuff, because it's more like the Irish traditions, And it's a language barrier partly, that the Japanese folk songs, however cool they are from my perspective, just don't speak to other people. That's the way it goes. The Swedish session I go to, there are no songs in that either. Of course the Swedes sing, but if you're going to have all these foreigners playing Swedish tunes, even though a couple of people there have learned some Swedish and all that, it's just a different world. So, well, you live with it in Japan, yeah. And I just wish there were a brighter future for the folk song, but, well, that's the way the world goes. English folk song, we now have something. Let's compare this simple example. I would have written a whole chapter in my book on this long ago if I had more space, but I never got around to it. Okay, England has traditional folk song. They used to have contests in the old days. People like Cecil Sharp went around doing village recordings, and then they'd make notations of it and often change the music a bit. Shouldn't have done. And often change some of the lyrics that were too bawdy or something, or they thought they were too folky, you know. So the collections aren't always perfect for that purpose. But then pretty much as you are almost old enough to know that we had a folk boom in England in the 60s and 70s. I wasn't here yet, but particularly after the American Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary stuff, they got into it here too. And you had Sea Lice Span and all those groups, Fairport Convention. And ever since then, we've had plenty of creative folk here. And that folk doesn't have to be traditional. It's like the Bob Dylan tradition. You write your own new stuff, or you take a traditional song and add harmonies and stuff, or you take the traditional one and totally modify it. You write a lot of new tunes as well in the folky tradition. And I like all this. It's a wonderful phenomenon. And at one point, somebody many years ago called this new folk, N-U-F-O-L-K, to distinguish from the old folk. It's very complicated, but there's a lot of diversity here. The thing is, in Japan, if you're going to go beyond that traditional folk song style, okay, there was you can have Takeshi, what's his name, and the Swingin' Blue Jeans. There was a a group of rock guitarists who were doing the imitation of this loud Tsugaru Shamisen rock style that I was mentioning, but they played on electric guitars. So this is westernization grabbing onto tradition. That is happening in the folk world to some degree. There are recordings and there are orchestral arrangements, just like Vaughan Williams and people like that in England have made arrangements of folk songs, folk melodies at least. Benjamin Britten did that. Japan, this is becoming a total disaster of a narrative, but never mind. When it comes to Japan trying to keep the tradition going and mix with the modernization, that means Japan plus the West. Whereas here in England, you start with your British songs and it's the West plus the West. You're just mixing different types of Western music. For Japan, it's native versus alien. And that's more of an interesting and difficult problem because it, to some degree, dilutes the native flavor of this stuff. So it's quite a challenge, really.